Hi everyone and welcome to this course. Today, NORC at the University of Chicago and UCLA Center for Health Policy Research will be presenting this course on applying ways to achieve fair representation. We will be looking at how to ensure that survey results accurately represent populations of interest. Before we dive in, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Mamadou Diallo. I'm Principal Data Scientist at NORC in the Statistics and Data Science Department. I also want to acknowledge that this work is a team effort representing the work of teams at NORC and at UCLA. What is fair representation and why does it matter? Fair representation is the foundation for valid conclusion. Fair representation ensures that all groups of interest are properly reflected in the data. For example, we may be interested in administrative divisions, in race and ethnicity, sex, age group, language, income levels, and so on. We want to make sure that the result coming from the survey fairly represent these groups. Also, complex sampling designs often lead to imbalances in terms of sample sizes, meaning that the share of the groups in the samples are different from the true share in the target populations. Finally, in large surveys, we always face operational challenges. Sometimes these operational challenges may lead to imbalances. For example, some part of population can be underrepresented. An example could be that a survey is underrepresented representing rural population because of access issue, or that we have uninsured populations that are underrepresented in the health study. In the previous slide, we saw that some imbalances may be due to our sampling design. So in this one, we will be looking at some examples of imbalances due to sampling. In complex samplings, we often use sophisticated techniques like stratification and oversampling. Stratification is a technique where we partition or split our population into groups, and we select independently within each group. We may sometimes select a different rate across the groups, leading to imbalances. Also, oversampling is a situation where we have a group of we are interested in that has a relatively small share in the population. To make sure that we have enough sample size to have accurate analysis, we may increase the sampling rate for that group, leading to imbalances. On the operational side, we may run into issues that may increase our imbalance in the sample. For example, we may have some groups that are harder to reach, leading to higher non-response, for example. We may have a limited budget of time to conduct follow-ups to increase our response rate. The refusal or participation ability of the participant may be higher in some group relatively to others, leading also to imbalances. All these situations are a possible reason or cause for further imbalances in our sample that we may address with sample weighting. Given that these imbalances are very common in a study, the question is how can we correct for them? This will bring us to the core of this presentation, sample weighting. Let's define what we mean by weighting. A sampling weight is a number we assign to each person or unit in our sample. This number tells us how many people in the broader population that one sampled person represents. Here is a simple way to think about it. Imagine we randomly select 10 people out of a population of 100, and everyone had the same chance of being picked. In that case, each person we surveyed would have a sampling weight of 10 because they represent themselves and 9 other people. The ultimate goal here is to use these weights to generalize our findings from the sample to the target population. The sampling weight allow us to correct for imbalances caused by the sampling design, non-response, and coverage issues. Let's make this more concrete with a basic example. We are going to compare proportional sample to a not proportional sample to better understand the weighting calculation. So here we assume a population of 10,000 people. 7,000 live in urban areas and 3,000 live in rural areas, giving us a split of 70 versus 30%. If you look at the columns in proportional sample, we're going to select a sample of 100 and we're going to be allocating the sample proportionally, meaning we're going to have 70 units in the urban areas and 30 units in the rural area. To calculate the weight, we divide the population size by the sample size. So that gives us in the urban areas a weight of 100 for each sampled unit there. And in the rural, we get the same weight of 100. So here we see that all units in the sample have the same weight. That's what we call self-weighting. They have the same weight across the sample. On the other hand, we can look at the columns on the not proportional sample. In here, we still have 100 units, but we decide to split them 50-50, meaning we have 50 in the urban areas and 50 in the rural areas. So now, if we calculate this, the sample size, we will have 7,000 divided by 50, giving us a weight of 140. So each person in the urban areas represent 140 people, including himself or herself. And following the same methodology, we will get a weight of 60 for the rural. In this case, we can see that the weights of the people in the urban are different from the weight of the people in the rural. So this case is not a self-weighting sample. Let's visit how we calculate sample weight. In practice, we calculate sample weight into 3 steps. In the first step, we calculate the design weight. Design weight is defined as the inverse of the probability of selection. For example, if you had a 1 over 100 chance of being selected, your weight will be 100. In step 2, we adjust for non-response, which means we redistribute the weight of the non-respondent to the respondent of the study. The third step and final step is calibration. This step is optional but often performed in large surveys. Calibration can be performed in different ways. One way to do calibration is post-stratification. In post-stratification, we adjust sample weight so that weighted totals from the samples across adjustment cells match the total from non-external sources. So, for example, we want that the weighted total defined by age and gender cells match total from census, for example. It is important to use trusted sources to perform calibration. Another technique is raking. In raking, we iteratively adjust sample weight to match totals across different dimensions or variables. So, for example, in this situation, we calibrate for age first, then we calibrate for education, and we repeat the cycle until the weight converges. And the last option to do calibration is the general calibration techniques, which is a mathematical optimization techniques where we still calibrate the weights to match totals from external sources, but we do it using auxiliary variables or also known as covariates And the minimization technique here ensure that the optimization or the calibration is done in a way that the final samples are as close as possible to the original one from the sample. The design weight is the inverse of the probability of selection. So the question is, how do we obtain the probability of selection? The probability of selection is derived from the sampling technique used. Here on this slide, I listed commonly used sampling techniques. The first one is sample random sampling. In these techniques, every unit in the population has the same probability of being included in the population, in the sample. The second technique is systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, we select every case unit from a list. For example, we may select every 10 households from a street. In stratified sampling, we partition the population into groups and we independently select from each group. The keyword here is independently. Therefore, we may use different sampling techniques or different sampling rates and so on. In cluster sampling, we don't select directly the unit, but we group the unit first into clusters and we select the clusters. So for example, instead of selecting household directly, we group the household into neighborhoods and then we select neighborhoods. This is often used when we don't have a list of the units to select from. Proportional to size sampling is where we select a unit based on their size, and the size is often referred as measures of size. Measures of size can be number of household, enrollment in education settings, can be revenue or income or number of employee in business setting and so on. Often the unit with larger measures of size have higher probability of being included in the sample. In practice, in large surveys or in complex design, we do not just use one of these techniques, but we use a combination of these techniques to come up with a sample. Non-response is expected in every large survey. The question is, how can we adjust our sample weight so that the results from the sample are still a fair representation of the target population? The issue with non-response is that different groups may have different non-response rate. Therefore, the adjustment should take into account this differential in response rate to minimize the bias in our estimates. To adjust for non-response, we follow these two steps. In the first steps, we create non-response classes. The idea of non-response classes is to form groups where the response rates are similar or the response rate is similar across the unit in that class. And in each class, we redistribute the weight of the non-respondent to the respondent in the same class. As outlined earlier, calibration is the last step in our sampling process. We also saw that post-stratification is one of the techniques used for calibration. Here we will review post-stratification. So in post-stratification, we adjust some sample weights to ensure that weighted total match non-population totals across specific categories. These categories are formed by crossing variables of interest. For example, we may cross age, sex, and region to form cells. And within each of those cells, we will ensure that the weighted sample totals match the population totals from trusted sources, like census, for example. So why do we apply post-stratification? We apply post-stratification to improve representativeness of our sample. We may also use post-stratification to reduce bias due to non-response and other operational challenges. Finally, we may also use post-stratification to keep our analysis aligned to non-external sources. For example, we may use post-stratification to ensure that our result from our sample align to the last available census. Let us use this sample example to illustrate how post-stratification works. So let's consider this sample. We have two groups, 1834 male, and the second group is 1834 female. So to post-stratify in each group, we will obtain the total from trusted source, for example, the census or registry or some administrative data. Then we will estimate the total number of units from our sample. This is the total weighted number of units from our sample for the group. And then we will calculate the adjustment factor as the ratio of the total coming from the external source to the total coming, the weighted total coming from the sample. And then to obtain the final adjusted weight, we will multiply the original weight by the adjustment factor. So in this example, we will further illustrate post-stratification using actual numbers. So in this example, we will use two age group. So the first age group is 1834 and the second age group is 35 plus. We have the non-total from external source, so 400 and 600 for the two groups. And then based on our sample and the weights in the original weight in our sample, we have the weighted totals are 300 from the younger age group and 700 from the older age group. And then we can see here there is, compared to the non-trusted source, there's a discrepancy here. We have under sampled on the younger groups and over represented on the older group. So here what we can do is use post-stratification to correct for this potential bias. So here by dividing 400 to 300, we can obtain the adjustment factor for the younger groups as 1.3. And then by doing the same operation for the older groups, we have an adjustment factor of 0.86 approximately. So therefore, we can use these two adjustment factors to multiply by the original weight in our sample to obtain the post-stratified weight. Raking is another technique we use for calibration. So raking is also called iterative proportional fitting, which consists of adjusting sample weight so that marginal weighted distribution match non-population totals for multiple variables. So for example, we have totals for age, we have totals separately for sex, we have totals separately for regions, but we don't have the total for the cross tabulations of those three. So what we can do using raking is to adjust for the first variable, then we adjust for the second variables, then we adjust for the third variables. By adjusting for further variables, we undo a little bit what we adjusted for previous variable. So we go back and redo the cycle of adjusting for age, then for sex, then for regions, and we repeat that cycle until we get conversions. Usually conversions happen into a short number of iterations. So why do we do rakings? So as you understand from the description of the methodology, often we don't have cross tabulation or cells defined by cross tabulating variables. So we need to match these cells independently by variables. In that case, using raking is an excellent choice. But also sometimes, even if you have the cross tabulation, the total for the cells in the cross tabulation, these cells may be too small to perform post-stratification or other calibration techniques. Uh, Therefore, in this situation, raking is often a good alternative and stable one to adjust for the weights and achieve conversions. In this slide, we are going to illustrate the raking methodology. So this is a simple example to give you an idea of how it works. So imagine you have two variables, sex and age, and we want to adjust the weight using the raking methodology. So we will start by adjusting the weight for the sex totals. So adjust for male and female. Then in the next step, we will adjust the weight for the age groups. By adjusting the weight for the age group, you're going to undo a little bit the weight for the previous adjustment on sex. Then we're going to repeat to redo the adjustment for the sex variable, and then we will adjust for age group. And then we can keep cycling, adjusting for sex, then for age, then for sex, then for age, until the weight converges and stop changing for a small amount that we determine. So this usually converges after a few number of iterations, maybe a handful usually. So here in the example, you have sex that are 50% male and female. Age group, you have 40% for the younger age group and 60% for the older age group. And we have the sample, which is 70-30 for the sex and then 20-80 for the female. So clearly, our sample have different distribution than the population. So to correct for this potential bias, we can use the algorithm that I described on using raking, where we're going to adjust for the sex and then for the age and then cycle through until the distribution on our sample match the distribution that we have on the population. And finally, we have the general calibration technique. So this technique adjusts the sample weight so that the weighted total match known population figures are called auxiliary variables. So this is similar to the post-stratification and raking techniques. However, the fundamental difference here is that it's going to try to minimize the changes from the original weight to the post-stratified weight. So why do we use general calibration instead of post-stratification or ranking? One of the reasons can be that we have many auxiliary variables. And in that context, post-stratification may not converge. And even raking can fail sometimes when we have many variables. Another reason can be to preserve the information of the original design. And then finally, is a better methodology when we have small or sparse post-strata cells. After adjusting the sample weights, we need to conduct some validation before finalizing the weights. This validation will help us make sure that the weights behave as expected and produce reliable and representative results. Some of the validation that we can conduct on the weights are the following. We can check that the weights are not too extreme. We can also check that the weights are not too variable. We can also check that the weighted estimates from the sample for some key variables, like the demographic variables, or some key other variables of interest, track benchmark known from external sources, like the census or some other trusted sources, maybe from previous similar survey that was conducted recently. Here on this slide, I go more into details on the statistics that we can check while validating the weights. So on the distribution of the weight, we can check for outliers. So we don't want weights that are too large or weights that are too small, because these weights can have outsized impact on our estimates. Another thing we can check is the coefficient of variation to assess whether our weights are stable. On the weighted estimates, we can compare the weighted totals to external sources, as we discussed from the census or previous surveys, something reliable that we know from the target population. We can use key characteristics like demographic, age, administrative variables like regions, and so on. And lastly, we can also check the design effect. When we adjust for sample weights and we departure from self-weighting, where all the units don't have the same weight, we add additional variability to our estimates. We want to check that we have not added too much variability to our estimate so that the estimate becomes unstable. So we can use the design effect, which is a measure that tell us how much variability we added from the estimate by an equal weighting. So when we have a number equal to 1, that means we didn't add any variability due to weighting. And as that number increases, we will be adding. So the goal here to keep that number as low, close to 1 as possible. Theory is great, but now we are going to walk through a simple case study to see the impact of weighting versus not weighting on our data. Let us consider this scenario. You conducted a quick health survey in a small region with 100 people in your sample. Your sample has 60 female and 40 male. However, you know that in the actual population, the distribution is about 50% female and 50% male. Therefore, you know that the distribution in your sample is off with regard to the actual population. In your survey, you ask the following question. Do you exercise at least 3 times a week? First, we are going to review the unweighted result. Among the 60 women in the sample, 40 said they were exercising at least 3 times a week, giving you a 66.7% exercising rate. Among the male, we have 20 that said they were exercising regularly, giving you a 50% rate. Therefore, overall, we have 60 out of 100 in your sample that said they were exercising regularly, giving you an overall exercising rate of 60%. Therefore, you might be tempted to conclude that 60% of the population in this region exercise regularly. However, the unweighted sample, overrepresent female compared to male in this population. Therefore, we are going to weight the sample to see if the conclusion will change or not based on the weighted sample. We are going to use post-stratification to adjust the weight in our sample. We know that in our sample, female are overrepresented and male are underrepresented. We know that in the population, we have a distribution of 50% female and 50% male. However, in our sample, we have 60% female and 40% male. To obtain the adjustment factor for the female, we're going to divide the 50% in the population by the 60% from our sample. And we will obtain a factor of 0.83 approximately. We're going to do the same calculation for the male, and then we're going to obtain a ratio or factor of 1.25. This means that we will adjust the weight of the female slightly lower, and we will increase the weight of the male slightly higher to ensure that our sample appropriately reflect the distribution of female and male in the targeted population. We are going to use the post-stratified weight to calculate the exercising rate. We know that in our sample, 40 female said that they were exercising regularly. So we're going to multiply 40 times the weight of the female, then we get 33.3. We're going to do a similar calculation for the male. So we're going to multiply 20, which is the number of men who said yes, by 1.25 to get a total of 25. So by adding 33.3 and 25, we get a total estimated of 58.3 people who are regularly exercising in this region. To get the rate, we divide by the total estimated number of people in the sample, as shown in the equation here. So in summary, we have 58.3% exercising rate in the region. Note that the weighted estimate of 58.3% is smaller than the initial estimate of 60%. This reflects the better representativeness of the sample across sex. Now let us wrap up and summarize what we have discussed so far. Here are some key takeaways from today's session. First, remember that weighting isn't about achieving perfection. It's about improving fairness and reducing bias. It makes our data better. Second, the weighting process generally follows a sequence. You start with the design weight, then you adjust for non-response, then you often calibrate using a method like post-stratification, raking, or the general calibration. And finally, when should you use weighting? You should always consider it when your sample design is complex, when you know that certain groups are under or overrepresented in your data, and most importantly, whenever you want to generalize your sample result to the broader population. It is important to be aware of the limitations of weighting. It is a powerful tool, but not a magic bullet. Weighting cannot fix a fundamentally bad sample. It adjusts for known differences between the sample and population, but it cannot rescue biased design or poor data collection practices. The effectiveness of calibration methods like post-stratification and rakings depends on having good, accurate auxiliary data for respondent and non-respondent. Having high variability in your final weights can be a problem. Very large and skewed weight can inflate the variance of your estimates, making them unstable and less precise. Our non-response adjustment rely on a key assumption that within our adjustment groups, the people who responded are similar to those who did not respond. This is often very hard to validate. And finally, with some methods like raking, there are times when the iterative process might fail to converge, especially if you have sparse or too many adjustment categories. So, to close, here are a few practical recommendations for applying weighting in your own work. Start simple and validate as you go. Use basic post-stratification or raking for common variables like age, sex, and region, and then check the results before getting more complex. Always inspect your weight distribution. Before you start your final analysis, look for extreme values, for high coefficient of variation, or other outliers. Whenever possible, use known benchmarks. Calibrating your data to trusted population sources like census data is one of the best ways to improve accuracy. Whenever possible, use non-trusted benchmark to calibrate your weight. Document all your weighting steps. For transparency and reproducibility, it is critical to record uh, exactly how your weight were calculated, adjusted, and calibrated. And finally, remember to balance bias and variance. Don't get too focused on matching known totals that you create highly variable weights. Sometimes a small amount of bias is acceptable if it means your estimates are more stable and precise. Here is a list of some of the key academic resources in the field of survey sampling and data analysis that inform this presentation. That brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention.